Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to hear me today with your heart, not just your ears. Because what I'm about to say is not just a speech, it's a revelation. A truth that will shake the very foundation of doubt and fear in your life. The words you're about to hear have the power to lift you out of confusion, to break chains you didn't even know were holding you, and to set you on a course toward a destiny that has already been written in the mind of God. You may have felt trapped. You may have looked at your situation and thought there is no way out. But let me tell you something. Just because you don't see a way doesn't mean there isn't one. Just because doors have been shut in your face doesn't mean the path is blocked. Just because people walked away, resources dried up, and plans fell apart doesn't mean the journey is over. No. That is when God steps in. That is when God does his best work. That is when God makes a way where there was no way. The problem is that we have conditioned ourselves to believe in what we see instead of believing in what God has spoken. We look at circumstances, at bank accounts, at medical reports, at statistics, and we say, there is no way. But God says, I am the way. He doesn't find the way, he is the way. When Israel stood at the Red Sea, they saw an obstacle, but God saw an opportunity. He didn't build a bridge, he didn't give them boats, he parted the waters. He made a way they could not have imagined, because when God makes a way, it will not be according to human logic, it will be according to divine power. Listen to me carefully. You do not need to know how, you just need to know who. You don't have to figure it all out. You don't have to control every outcome. You just have to trust that the God who created the universe has already mapped out the road ahead. Your job is not to make it happen. Your job is to walk by faith, knowing that he has already gone before you. But here's what you must understand. God does not make a way for those who sit in fear. He does not part the waters for those who refuse to move. He makes a way for those who take steps of faith. The Red Sea did not part until Moses stretched out his hand. The Jordan River did not stop flowing until the priest stepped into the water. The walls of Jericho did not fall until the people marched around them. What does that tell you? It tells you that your faith activates the way God is making for you. If you are waiting to see the way before you move, you will wait forever. But if you step out in obedience, the way will be revealed as you walk. And let me warn you, when God makes a way, it won't always look the way you expect. Sometimes he makes a way by removing people from your life. Sometimes he makes a way by shutting doors you wanted to walk through. Sometimes he makes a way by allowing discomfort to push you into your destiny. You may not like the process, but you will love the result, because what God is doing is not just making a way for you, he is making you for the way. I don't know what you are facing today. I don't know what mountain is standing in your path. I don't know what storm is raging around you. But I do know this. God is still in the business of making a way. And when he does, it will be bigger than you imagine, greater than you hope, and more powerful than you dream. So don't give up. Don't turn back. Don't settle for a life of fear and doubt. Keep walking. Keep believing. Keep trusting, because the way is already made. The only question is, will you have the faith to walk in it? God is about to surprise you. Get ready. The way is opening before you. God is the way, not just the way maker. When we see obstacles, God sees opportunities. He doesn't just find a way, he is the way. Faith activates the way. The Red Sea didn't part until Moses stretched out his hand, and the Jordan River didn't stop until the priest stepped in. God responds to movement, not hesitation. God's way is beyond human logic. His methods are supernatural and often unexpected. He won't always open doors the way we anticipate, but he will always lead to the right path. Disruptions are often divine directions. Closed doors, lost opportunities, and discomfort might feel like setbacks, but they are often the very things pushing us into our God-ordained destiny. The way is already made. You don't need to see the whole path before moving forward. God has already mapped out your journey. You just need to trust and walk by faith. Expect the unexpected. When God makes a way, it will exceed your expectations, surprise your enemies, and glorify his name. Stay ready, because breakthrough is coming. When we face challenges, we often find ourselves searching for solutions, trying to find a way out of our problem. It's natural to look around, consider our options, and hope for an escape route. However, what we often fail to realize is that God doesn't simply find a way in our lives. He is the way. This statement is not just a theological idea. It's a foundational truth that can radically change the way we live, think, and approach life's struggles. In moments of adversity, we look at our circumstances, hoping to find an external solution. We may turn to our resources, our networks, our intelligence, or even the people around us to provide a way forward. And while these things can be helpful, they are limited by human understanding and capacity. But when God is the way, he operates beyond these limitations. His way is not confined to human logic, systems, or methods. He is not bound by time, space, or the constraints that define our lives. God is eternal, and he sees everything from a divine perspective beyond what we can even imagine. In the Bible, the Israelites stood at the edge of the Red Sea, trapped between an impassable body of water and the approaching Egyptian army. They saw no way out. To their eyes, they were facing certain destruction. Yet God didn't find a way for them to escape. He became the way. He parted the waters, opening up a path where there was none. This wasn't a temporary fix. It was an act of divine intervention that not only saved the Israelites, but revealed something profound about who God is. He doesn't just help us find solutions. He steps into our situations and transforms them entirely. When we understand that God is the way, it means that the solutions we seek don't always have to be found in the things we can see, touch, or understand. It's not about creating a perfect plan or having everything figured out. It's about recognizing that God can create a way in the most impossible of circumstances. It shifts our focus from trying to control every detail of our lives to surrendering to God's plan. His way is not limited by our expectations or our understanding, and this gives us hope even in the most uncertain times. In addition, when God is the way, it means that we don't have to fear when we can't see the next step. We often let fear take hold when we can't predict the outcome of a situation. We worry about what will happen, how we will get through, or what the future holds. But when God is the way, we are assured that he is guiding us. Even when we can't see the path clearly, we can trust that he is leading us forward. He doesn't need our sight to make a way. He simply needs our faith. So when we face challenges, we don't need to focus solely on finding a way in. Instead, we can rest in the truth that God is the way. He will lead, guide, and provide in ways that transcend our understanding. All we need to do is trust him and walk in faith, knowing that he is the ultimate source of our direction, strength, and provision. Faith is the key that unlocks the doors of divine provision and breakthrough. When we look at the stories in the Bible, it becomes evident that God's response to our situations is not triggered by our ability to figure everything out, but by our willingness to step forward in faith. Faith, in essence, is not passive. It requires movement, action, and trust in what God has already promised. It is the belief that even though we may not see the way, God is already at work to make it possible. Take the story of Moses. and the Israelites standing at the edge of the Red Sea with the Egyptian army fast approaching. They had no way of escaping, no natural solution to their dilemma. But what happened? God instructed Moses to stretch out his hand over the sea. At that moment, the waters parted, creating a path for them to walk through. The sea didn't part until Moses acted in faith. God didn't ask Moses to have all the answers. He asked Moses to trust him and take that first step by raising his hand. It was Moses' act of faith, his willingness to obey and move, that triggered God's miracle. Similarly, when the Israelites crossed the Jordan River to enter the promised land, the waters didn't stop flowing until the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant stepped into the river. Imagine standing at the edge of a powerful river with no bridge, no way to get across, and no clear path. But God told them to step in. The water didn't recede until they acted. If they had waited to see the waters dry up first, they would have missed out on the miracle. God wanted them to demonstrate faith by moving before they saw the result. This principle is critical. God is waiting for you to step forward, to act in faith before he reveals the full way. If you stand still, waiting for everything to align perfectly, you may never experience the breakthrough he has planned for you. This concept applies to our lives in ways we may not always recognize. Often we are paralyzed by fear, doubt, and uncertainty. We want to see everything unfold before we move. We want guarantees. We want to know that if we take a step, everything will be okay. But God doesn't always work that way. His call is for us to trust him even when we can't see the full picture, even when we're unsure about the outcome. It's easy to sit back and hope for a sign, but real faith is about taking action when nothing seems certain. It's trusting that as we move forward in obedience, the way will become clear. God does not require us to know every detail. He requires us to trust him enough to move in the direction he has set. Faith is not a feeling. It is a choice to act on what God has said, regardless of the circumstances around us. When we choose to walk by faith, we activate God's power to work on our behalf. So if you are facing a challenge today, know that God is calling you to step forward in faith. Your next move, no matter how small it seems, could be the very thing that opens the door to the breakthrough you've been praying for. When we talk about God's way, we must understand that it does not always follow human logic or conventional thinking. God's ways are often higher, deeper, and more profound than anything we can conceive. The very nature of divine intervention transcends the limitations of our understanding, and his methods frequently defy the expectations of the natural world. This truth should not discourage us. Instead, it should encourage us to embrace the mystery and beauty of how God works. Think about the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000. Jesus took 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, and from this small offering he fed a crowd of over 5,000 people. In human terms, that makes no sense. We would never look at 5 loaves and 2 fish and think that they could feed thousands. Yet when God is involved, he can multiply the most unlikely resources in ways that exceed all understanding. God didn't need to find a supermarket or a bakery to provide. He doesn't rely on our systems, our plans, or our resources. His power operates independently of anything we could imagine. Similarly, consider the story of Gideon in the Old Testament. When God called Gideon to lead Israel to victory against the Midianites, he told him to reduce his army from 32,000 soldiers to just 300. From a human perspective, this made no sense. How could 300 men defeat an army of thousands? The logical answer would have been to gather as many soldiers as possible, equip them with the best weapons, and prepare for battle. But God's strategy was different. He wanted to show that victory comes not from our strength, but from his power. God's way was not based on military strategy or numbers. It was based on trust and obedience. And of course, Gideon's small army defeated the Midianites not because they were stronger, but because they followed God's instructions, trusting in his plan rather than relying on their own understanding. This principle applies to our lives in profound ways. We often try to fit God's solutions into the mold of our expectations. We look for ways that make sense, methods that align with our own logic, and answers that are rooted in what we know. But when God makes a way, it will rarely make sense from a natural perspective. His solutions are often beyond our comprehension. He will do things in your life that may seem illogical, unconventional, and even impossible according to human standards. But that is the beauty of God's ways. They are not bound by the limits we impose on them. When we recognize that God's way is not constrained by human logic, it frees us from the pressure of trying to figure everything out. We don't have to see how everything will unfold. We don't have to have all the answers. We simply need to trust that even when things don't make sense, God is at work in ways that we cannot fully comprehend. His ways are not meant to be understood in the way we understand the world. They are meant to demonstrate his power, his creativity, and his authority over everything. So when God makes a way for you, don't be surprised if it doesn't look like what you expected. His ways are always better, even when they seem confusing. They may not fit into the logical framework of your mind, but they will always bring you to the place where his purpose for your life is fulfilled. God's way is greater than any plan you can create, and that is the beauty of his divine intervention. Often in life, we find ourselves facing disruptions, disappointments, and closed doors. We encounter situations where things don't go as planned, and it feels as if everything is falling apart. It's easy to interpret these challenges as setbacks, failures, or even punishments. However, one of the most profound truths about God's way is that disruptions, delays, and disappointments are sometimes the very tools he uses to direct us towards something better. In reality, God's interruptions are often divine directions that are leading us to our purpose, our destiny, and our greatest breakthrough. Take, for instance, the story of Joseph in the Bible. Joseph's life was full of interruptions. He was betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, falsely accused of a crime, and thrown into prison. These were not just setbacks, they were life-altering disruptions that seemed to derail any hopes of fulfilling his dreams. Yet, God used these very disruptions to position Joseph for greatness. His time in prison was not wasted. It was preparing him for the role he was destined to fulfill as a ruler in Egypt. Every painful event was in fact part of God's plan to elevate him. What seemed like an obstacle was actually the process of God preparing Joseph for the place he needed to be. Similarly, many of us may experience doors closing or opportunities slipping away. We often ask ourselves, why is this happening to me? Why am I being held back? The truth is, sometimes God closes a door to protect us from something we may not be able to see, or he redirects us to a better path that we haven't even imagined. The Bible says that God's thoughts are higher than our thoughts, and his ways are higher than our ways. We may not understand the reasons behind certain disruptions, but God sees the end from the beginning. His timing is always perfect, even if it doesn't align with our expectations. One powerful example of this is the story of the Apostle Paul. Paul had a deep desire to spread the gospel across the Roman Empire, but on several occasions he faced detours and obstacles. In Acts 16, for instance, Paul tried to go to certain regions to preach, but the Holy Spirit kept him from going there. At first it seemed like a disruption to Paul's plans, but these interruptions were God's way of guiding him to the right place. Ultimately, Paul was led to Macedonia, where his ministry flourished and the gospel spread in ways it might not have in the regions he initially wanted to visit. When disruptions happen in our lives, it's crucial to remember that God is still in control. What we perceive as a detour may actually be the exact direction we need. God is orchestrating events, guiding us with his wisdom and positioning us for greater opportunities that we cannot yet see. Instead of resisting these disruptions, we should lean into God's plan with trust and patience. He is using every setback to set us up for success in his perfect time. In essence, God's disruptions are not the end of the road. They are often the divine preparations for something far greater. While we may not understand them in the moment, when we look back, we will see how God has used every delay and interruption to shape us into who we are meant to be. So instead of focusing on what's being taken away, let's focus on what God is positioning us for. The very thing you think is a disruption may be the direction to your breakthrough. One of the most empowering truths about God's way is that it is already prepared even before we encounter the challenges or obstacles that seem to block our path. When we are faced with a difficult situation, we often feel like we are starting from scratch, trying to figure out how to navigate the way forward. We become overwhelmed by the uncertainty of the future and the unknowns that lie ahead. But the reality is God has already made a way for us. He has already gone before us, preparing the road and clearing the path even when we can't see it. This concept is crucial because it shifts our focus from trying to control every aspect of our journey to trusting in God's sovereignty. Too often we try to chart out every detail, seeking guarantees and answers before we move forward. We want the plan to unfold before us so we can feel secure and confident. But the beauty of God's provision is that we don't need to know all the details. We simply need to trust that he has already gone before us, laying the foundation for our steps, even when we can't see it. Think about the journey of the Israelites as they moved toward the promised land. God told them that he had already given them the land, but they had to go in and take possession of it. The land was already prepared for them, filled with everything they would need, but they still had to walk through it and claim it. The obstacles they encountered along the way, like the walls of Jericho or the giants in the land, weren't signs that God had failed to make a way. Instead, they were opportunities for the Israelites to trust that God had already planned their victory. The way was already made, but their faith and obedience were required to access it. In our lives, we often face circumstances that seem insurmountable, and we may question whether we are on the right path. But God has already prepared the way for us. The job you're seeking, the breakthrough you're praying for, the relationships you're hoping to restore, God has already gone ahead and prepared what you need. We may not always see how it's going to unfold, but by faith we trust that the way is already made. Our job is not to worry about how everything will work out, but to keep moving forward, trusting that God has already arranged the details, even the ones we can't yet understand. This understanding also gives us peace in the midst of uncertainty. When we feel unsure or anxious about the future, we can remind ourselves that God is not surprised by the challenges we face. He has already accounted for them, and he has already made provisions for us. Our faith then is not just in the belief that God can make a way, but in the assurance that the way has already been made. We simply need to walk in it step by step, trusting that he is guiding us along the path he has already prepared. In essence, the way is already made, and our role is to walk in obedience and faith, knowing that God has gone ahead of us. When we trust in his plan, we can face any obstacle with confidence, knowing that the path ahead has already been cleared. When God makes a way in our lives, we must be prepared for the unexpected. We We often envision how things should unfold based on our understanding and what we've seen in the past. We create a mental picture of the ideal scenario, expecting the solution to come in a way that feels familiar and comfortable to us. However, God's way rarely looks like what we imagine. His methods are often surprising, and his answers come in ways we never would have anticipated. This truth is powerful because it challenges our natural tendency to limit God to our own understanding. We think we know what's best for our lives, but God sees the big picture, the one we can't fully comprehend. He knows the timing, the people, and the circumstances that will bring about the best result for us. When we expect God to move in a certain way, we often miss the incredible things he is doing in the background, beyond our scope of vision. Consider the story of the blind man in the Gospel of John chapter 9 verse 9. Jesus was approached by his disciples who asked him why the man was born blind. Instead of simply healing him in a conventional manner, Jesus spit on the ground, made mud with his saliva, and put it on the man's eyes. Then he told him to wash in the pool of Siloam. This was not how anyone would expect a healer to restore sight, but it was the method that Jesus chose. The blind man had to trust in Jesus' unconventional approach, and through his obedience, he received his sight. This story illustrates that God does not always use traditional or expected methods to bring about healing, restoration, or breakthrough. His ways are often surprising, but they are always effective. Another powerful example comes from the story of Naaman, a commander in the Syrian army who suffered from leprosy. When he sought healing from the prophet Elisha, he expected a grand display of power. Naaman thought that Elisha would come to him, wave his hand, and instantly heal him. But instead, Elisha told him to wash 7 times in the Jordan River. Naaman was initially offended because it didn't make sense to him. The river wasn't even the cleanest river, and he couldn't understand why such a simple act would bring about healing. However, after some persuasion, Naaman obeyed, and when he dipped 7 times in the Jordan, his leprosy was completely healed. Again, God's way was unexpected, but it was the way that brought him his miracle. In our own lives, we may find ourselves in situations where we are waiting for God to provide a solution in a specific way, perhaps through a person, a job, or an opportunity we are familiar with, but God may have a completely different method in mind. His solutions might not align with what we've imagined, and his timing may not match our expectations. But just because God's way surprises us does not mean it is any less powerful. In fact, the surprise is part of the miracle. It forces us to trust him more deeply and lean into the mystery of his will. When we recognize that God's way can surprise us, it frees us from limiting him. We no longer need to confine our thinking to what seems possible or practical in human terms. We can trust that he will make a way, even if it doesn't look like anything we expected. His surprises are often the very thing that lead to our greatest breakthroughs. In conclusion, when we recognize that God is the way in our lives, it shifts our perspective from feeling lost in the midst of challenges to trusting in his divine plan. God doesn't merely find a way, he is the way, and his ways transcend our understanding. Our faith activates the miraculous, and when we take steps in trust, even before we see the outcome, we allow God's power to work in our favor. We must also acknowledge that God's ways often defy human logic. His methods may be unexpected, but they are always purposeful and effective. Disruptions and closed doors are not signs of defeat, but are often divine directions guiding us towards something greater. These disruptions may not make sense at first, but when we look back, we see how God was preparing us for the path we are meant to walk. Furthermore, the way is already made. We don't need to have every detail figured out to take the next step. God has already paved the way for us. We simply need to trust him and move forward in faith. The breakthrough is already in place, even if we can't see it at the moment. Finally, God's way will often surprise us. It will come in forms we never anticipated, challenging our expectations and forcing us to trust him in new and deeper ways. His answers and solutions may look completely different from what we imagine, but they will always exceed our understanding and bring us to a place of victory. In every moment of uncertainty, remember that God is already at work, making a way for you. Your role is to trust, act in faith, and follow his lead. When you walk in obedience to his guidance, you will see how every disruption, delay, and challenge has been part of his perfect plan to bring you to your purpose. God is faithful, and he will make a way, no matter how impossible the situation may seem.